Testing 1, 1, 2, level check 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Testing. Could we have the French translation again for a level check, please? I'm checking the levels, voice level 1 and voice level 2. Check, check, sound check. Thank you. Excellencies, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Rob Spall. I'm the Head of Communications for the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, also known as IPBES. A very warm welcome to this highly anticipated media launch of the IPBES Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Before anything, I would like to please formally announce that the embargo, the media embargo, is formally lifted on all media material. So please, to our members of the media, feel free, if you haven't already done so, to go ahead and publish that material. A special word of welcome to everybody who's joining us via the webcast today, the live webcast. We're very sorry you couldn't be with us in person, but we're very happy that you are joining us virtually. I know, for instance, that we have groups of people watching in far-flung places around the world, ranging from a group in Switzerland to a group in Japan to a group in Canada. So all of you on the webcast, welcome to this launch. On that note, and for everybody's information, we will reserve at least 1/3 of all questions in the questions time this afternoon for questions coming from the live webcast, with 2/3 of questions for those people in the room. A quick note on interpretation. We are very fortunate to have simultaneous interpretation today from English to French and French to English. I would ask, for the sake of our interpreters, all speakers to please speak slowly and clearly when speaking to assist in that interpretation. I would like to start today by introducing our speakers who are at the podium today, starting with our very gracious host, the Director General of UNESCO, Audrey Azoulay. We're also joined by the Executive Secretary of IPBES, Dr. Anne Lara-Gaudry. In his first act as the immediate past chair of IPBES, we have Sir Robert Watson. And they're joined by the 3 co-chairs of the Global Assessment, Professors Sandra Diaz, Joseph Setele, and Eduardo S. Brondizio. I'd also like to acknowledge all of our IPBES experts who are seated here on this side in the front row. These are some of our coordinating lead authors, our lead authors, and other experts who've been involved in contributing to this landmark assessment report. Could all of our experts who are here please stand up so that the media can identify who you are and where you are? Thank you very much. And a reminder to all media present that our experts have been tagged with colored dots on their name badges in order to help you work out which languages they are fluent in for possible interviews following the press conference. As a reminder, they all speak fluent English, but those with red dots are also fluent in French, those with green dots are fluent in Spanish, and those with pink dots are fluent in German. I'd also like to introduce some of my media team who will be helping us today. Mr. Terry Collins in the front row and Julie de Beauville, if you could both stand up. These 2 colleagues will be assisting with media interviews following the press conference. If you'd like to be scheduling views, you can go directly to the would now like to invite make some opening remarks.
Thank you very much. I would like first to welcome you at UNESCO. And I think for the sake of language diversity, I'll speak French.
After the historic adoption of this first intergovernmental report on biodiversity at UNESCO, which is the product of years of research and international cooperation and adopted by 132 countries with the support of the United Nations, nothing will ever be the same, and no one can say that they didn't know that we are threatening our global environmental heritage, a common heritage built over the long history of the living on the planet. The work of scientists from all over the world documents this comprehensive and shared findings. With 1 million species threatened with extinction, with human activities that have profoundly altered most of the natural environments on the planet, thanks to them and thanks to you, we now have foundations for serious work and avenues for solutions adopted alongside with governments, which makes it possible for us to act. What we say with the report is that protecting biodiversity means protecting mankind, because we human beings depend fundamentally on the diversity of the living. We are part of a system that's based on the interactions whose benefits we don't always properly assess, be they material or intangible. What the report says is that the destruction of biodiversity threatens the vital contributions brought by nature to mankind, threaten our means of subsistence, a heritage, and I think it's important for us to say that here, it's a heritage which is cultural, tangible and intangible. Food security, the world economy, and the quality of life are also threatened. Biodiversity also disproportionately affects the most vulnerable populations. For all these reasons, this erosion of biodiversity threatens our world environmental heritage. And it's also a threat, therefore, to peace and to security. Therefore, we must act vis-a-vis the future generations, that we don't have the right to continue to deprive of their fundamental heritage. This basic issue of the erosion of biodiversity also reminds us, and it's important to make this point here in this United Nations organization, the importance of cooperation and of solidarity, as well as of multilateralism. This calls for responses at all levels, but also at the multilateral level, for international cooperation in response to this work of international experts. 2020 may prove to be a strategic year, as early as 2019, in fact, with the G7, which is being held in France now. In 2020, there will be the Congress of our central partner on the protection of natural heritage, that is the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and also in 2020 with the COP15 on biodiversity, which will be held in China. The importance of multilateralism can be seen with the support brought to IPBES from its founding by the UN through UNESCO, but also the FAO, the UNEP, and the UNDP. We in UNESCO were particularly keen on assisting IPBES in the fantastic work it's carrying out as a scientific organization of the UN, but also because we are the house of biodiversity in the broad sense of the term. We do this through promoting scientific cooperation at an international scale, and in particular our work on fresh waters, on research and oceanography, but also through the promotion of indigenous knowledge, which was fully reflected in the report. We also do this by encouraging member states to introduce more education for sustainable development into their educational systems. We also provide to member states which would like to commit themselves further means of conservation of nature through natural World Heritage Sites and biosphere reserves of UNESCO. biosphere reserves which reconcile the conservation of biodiversity and its sustainable use by the people who live there. This UNESCO label protects throughout the world a land area that's equivalent to the size of China, but it could be further extended if the states make the commitment to restore rights to nature. And we need to modify human behavior for sustainable solutions which can slow down or even offset the loss of biodiversity, which is well documented. To conclude, I would like to thank you for coming. I would like to underscore the substantial work performed by IPBES and by the network of scientists that they represent. I think it's a fundamental issue for peace and security, and it's also a major issue for the United Nations. It's also a moral and ethical issue for all of us with respect to posterity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Director General, for those important words from our hosts at UNESCO. I'd now like to invite the Executive Secretary of IPBES, Dr. Anne Larigadri, to make some remarks. Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. It's a real pleasure to present to the world today the first ever intergovernmental report of the state of knowledge related to biodiversity and ecosystem services. It is a report that has been produced by us, IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And we follow the noble path of the IPCC, which has shown the way on how science can inform policy making regarding climate change. So this report is the result of about 45 hours of intense negotiation here at UNESCO this week, a dialogue between scientists and policy makers. And it is a summary for policymakers, which is now owned by government as a result of this dialogue with the scientists. And they finally came to an agreement at 3 in the morning this past Saturday. It's a report that has taken about 3 years to produce. Hundreds of scientists, some of them are with us today together. They've analyzed more than 15,000 scientific publications, a large body of knowledge on biodiversity, on ecosystem services, and they have also included, and for the first time, indigenous and local knowledge, which is also an innovative path that IPBES is also trying to follow and to open new ways. So this is, of course, all done thanks to what I call the real treasures of IPBES, and those are our scientists who commit their time for free for all of these years. And we've calculated that together the amount of their time is equivalent to the amount of dollars governments have given to us, which is more than 40 million since we started about 5 years ago. So quite a considerable gift from the scientific community to IPBES. Yesterday, the former chair of IPBES, I have to learn how to say this, Bob Watson and I attended the G7 environment of the hosted by France, not too far from here in the east part of the country. And for the first time, a focus was placed on biodiversity, and biodiversity will be part of the final statements, with also commitments to be approved by the presidents when they meet at the G7 of presidents later this summer. So this afternoon we are invited by the President of the Republic of France, Mr. Macron, to present the outcome of the summary for policymakers of these assessments. And As you have seen, the conclusions of the report are really very alarming, and our co-chairs are going to present all of the facts that this report has highlighted. But really what we would like at the end of this report is to really give the world a real message of hope. We don't want that people feel discouraged, that there is nothing that can be done, that we've lost the battle, because we have not lost the battle. And if given a chance, nature will reconquer its rights and will prevail. And so we really want everyone to feel that they can contribute, that they are part of the solution. And this is very much the main message that this report is bringing to the world. So our goal, all of us, is to really elevate now the topic of biodiversity, to really bring it at the same level as climate on the top of the agenda of policy makers. We've now firmly established that there is a scientific evidence for the degradation of our nature, of the living world, of species of plants and animals. And yesterday, the minister said, now, with this scientific evidence, we can no longer say that we did not know. So we now really hand over to the world, to all of the citizens, to governments, to our colleagues at the Convention on Biological Diversity, who are going to have this major summit at COP15 in China next year. But really, what we want to say is that we are really all together in this. This is about the way we treat our world, our nature, about our future on this planet. And so, armed now with this new scientific evidence, what we really want to do is to make biodiversity great again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'm told by our technical staff that we are currently joined by more than 550 viewers on the English version of the YouTube connection and more than 120 on the French connection. So to everybody who's just joining us, who joined late, welcome. You've joined with enough time to still hear the findings of the report. And on that note, I would like to please ask the three co-chairs of the IPBES Global Assessment Report to share with us some of the high-level findings and some of the policy options of the report. And I'm going to hand the floor to our three co-chairs who will, I believe, split their time between all three of them. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to everybody on the podium, the friends on the podium, I would say. Our authors who are sitting there, very important. That's the basis of the entire assessment. So we have the pleasure to present the result of the work of the last 3 years in a kind of a nutshell approach, in a kind of very, let's say, fundamental, very scientific approach where I try to be integrative as much as possible. And it's an investment, a lot of people, where I can bring some data as well. So let's see how this works. It doesn't. So next slide. So actually we have been tasked with certain questions from the very beginning, which was so-called scoping document, which was provided to us by the IPBES partners, the governments at that time, around 120 at that time, around 125. Now it's 132 partner governments which are within IPBES. And they gave us a task to do this assessment. And they have posed us, let's say, 5 main questions. What is the status and the trend in nature and indirect and direct drivers of nature, of the change? How does nature contribute to the achievement of global goals? There are different sets of goals there. What are plausible futures for nature and for a good quality of life between now and 2050? What pathways and policy intervention scenarios can lead to sustainable futures? And last but not least, what are the opportunities and challenges as well as options available to the decision makers relating to nature and its contributions to good quality of life? So this is the kind of set of questions we had. We arranged the entire assessment along these questions, and now I'm trying to start with the main results. Well, first, the author team mentioned by Anne already before. It's a lot of people, 145 experts, 3 co-chairs, so the 3 of us sitting here, 24 coordinating lead authors, and many others involved there. A total of 350 contributing authors who have been taking part of the entire element. So it's more than 400, 500 people involved in the whole process from 51 countries. And you can see the balances. We had a certain dominance in natural sciences, but quite a lot of social sciences and those people who are called interdisciplinary experts. The gender spread was a bit uneven, but we are moving towards a more even one in the process of IPBES. So we started with a very bad one, but it's improving and improving, so we're getting there. There's this kind of male-female representation nicely there. So the finding, life on Earth is deteriorating fast worldwide, and virtually all indicators of the global state of nature are decreasing. It's about biomes, it's about ecosystems, it's about species, varieties, and breeds. So the latter one is varieties, breeds, mainly in the context of agriculture, a quite important component. Some of the data, well, many data are very well known. We have declines all across the animals and plants. And this just to illustrate the graph. On the left-hand side, you see on the red part the degree of endangerment in different groups of species. And on the right part, you see the greenish ones, which are more, let's say, in better shape. It's very different across different groups, just to give a general impression on this. But everywhere, across all groups of species, we have problems with their survival. Extinction rates is one important component. More species of plants and animals are threatened with extinction now than at any other time in human history. So it's the human history is the main component. Goes back as long as humans are there and modifying the Earth, and we are accelerating. Important component on the graph on the bottom is the natural extinction rate. It's a very tiny grayish thing. It shows the extinction rate is always there, but it's very low. So we have really contributed to increase this rate to a tremendous amount within the last decades. So this is the kind of very alarming component. The underpinning, the proximate causes of deterioration in nature are the root causes. So this is the kind of the indirect drivers, which are the main background drivers which cause all the rest. So we have indirect drivers, which are demographic things, which are economic and technological backgrounds, institutional governance, and also conflicts and epidemics can be mentioned there, all also led by social values, which leads to the direct drivers, which we have analyzed in a very rigorous analysis throughout the assessment, where we can really say which are the most important ones and which are less so. And all of the different systems, terrestrial, freshwater, and marine, are driven by land use and sea use change as the main driver, followed by exploitation and then climate change at the present time. And then it's, the other one is pollution and invasive species and then some others. But this is based on a very rigorous, very profound meta-analysis done by lots of our colleagues throughout this process for the last 3 years. It doesn't work.
This general deterioration of nature has important consequences for human quality of life. Our report contains a comprehensive analysis of the status and trends of 18 general categories of nature's contributions to people. Globally, since the 70s, more food, energy, and raw materials have been produced than ever before, but this has come at a price. Out of 18 categories of nature's contributions to people assessed, 14 have declined. This means that these increases in production and the associated waste is undermining nature's capacity to regulate processes and regenerate itself. It's also undermining non-material contributions to people, and it's also compromising nature's ability to provide all contributions, including material ones, in the future. All these trends have direct consequences for the achievement of internationally agreed biodiversity and development targets. In the case of the Aichi biodiversity targets, most of them will not be achieved. Partial progress has been observed in a minority of them, 4 out of 20, but none of these directly tackles the root causes of nature's decline. The picture is similar regarding the Sustainable Development Goals, with 35 out of 44 targets assessed showing negative or insufficient progress. In summary, there has been some progress, but not enough to stem the direct drivers, and especially the indirect drivers or root causes of nature's decline. In terms of projections farther into the future, we explored 3 families of plausible scenarios and their projected consequences for biodiversity and also for nature's material and regulating contributions to people by 2050. In all scenarios, climate change becomes increasingly important, compounding the effect of the other drivers. In all scenarios, there are trade-offs between increases in material benefits on the one hand and declines in biodiversity and regulating benefits on the other. There are very different trends for different regions. Next, please. Oops. Okay. This is particularly so in scenarios of regional competition, whereas global sustainability scenarios do much better. In contrast, as my colleague will explain next, plausible scenarios that include transformative change, especially in the production and consumption of energy and food, low to moderate population growth, and nature-friendly and socially fair climate adaptation and mitigation are compatible with the 2030 sustainability objectives and the 2050 vision for biodiversity. So the battle is not lost yet.
Thank you. Before we go to the best way scenarios to address those problems of this assessment at a global level of the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities, and also how those changes are affecting those communities on the ground, and what policy options may be available for a better future. You understand why it's important to include indigenous people and local communities? Because of the scale of importance at the global level. It's the first time that we have synthesized enough information to have a global picture of such important contributions. At least a quarter of the global land is owned, managed, traditionally occupied by indigenous peoples. That's where you have some of the highest conserved ecosystems. And 35% of the global protected areas overlap with areas of indigenous peoples. That shows their importance in safeguarding a lot of the biodiversity that we all benefit from, including a significant share of the global agrobiodiversity of plants and animals, in areas where you find the wild relatives of world crops. In analysis, nature is deteriorating less rapidly within those areas, but nonetheless suffering the same consequence. We did the most comprehensive analysis of local indicators, which is a compilation of over 450 indicators used around the world by local communities. 72% of those indicators show signs of decline. And other drivers are increasingly pressured, those areas through land use change, extractive industries, infrastructure expansion, and other factors. So indigenous people and local communities, along with other sectors of society, play a critical role. What my colleagues have shown is that we have reconfigured dramatically the fabric of life of the planet. And the 3 key words here is that, along with this deterioration, it's more interconnected and having cascading impacts, but distributed unequally. What are some of the key components analyzed? And this is a very short summary. As you imagine, we're providing a high-level set of messages for you. The report is very detailed on those particular options and possible pathways to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. If we want to meet the biodiversity conservation goals better than we did during the last decade, if we want to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, which Sandra just showed, 80% of the Sustainable Development Goals are compromised because of deterioration of nature and this cascading impacts on goals that are of social, that cover social dimensions. The first important message is that we cannot tackle nature deterioration in isolation from climate change and from our social goals. They are interconnected, and it's time to move to think about that complexity and including that complexity in our thinking and policy. They need to be looked at synergistically, and the options that we present provide opportunities for us to bring different sectors that try to address our demands for food, for water, for energy and health, our request for human well-being for all, and our need to address mitigation and adaptation to climate change and conserving nature. We need to start to think in an integrated way and apply our policies as such. Importantly, we have done a lot already. There's enough instruments, international agreements, local policies, local efforts that if more boldly deployed and other bold change decisions are made, those pathways to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals are possible. The knowledge is there. We need to move to more bold implementation. That means addressing not only the direct causes of change, which we can address with policies applied at the local, national, and regional levels on many of those sectors, but most importantly, confront the root causes of change. When we look back during the last 10 years, we have advanced significantly in confronting the direct drivers. When you look, for instance, at the expansion of protected areas on land and sea has been an effective way of confronting the fast transformation of land use and other forms of exploitations. But that goes so far, as those success stories become overwhelmed by the deterioration that happened around them. So we need to address the root causes with profound changes in aligning our governance systems, incorporating responsibility in our economic system in a way that accounts for the whole chain, from production to consumption. We need to address equity issues and consider solutions in the context of inequities that are out there. We need cross-sectoral planning, and we have the knowledge to implement cross-sectoral planning. We need positive incentives to move away from the harmful subsidies that many times are paying for the destruction that we're observing. And we need to change our narratives, both our individual narratives that associate wasteful consumption with quality of life and with status, and the narratives of the economic systems that still consider that environmental degradation and social inequality are inevitable outcomes of economic growth. We need to change that narrative. Economic growth is a mean and not an end. We need to look for the quality of life of the planet and consider the inequalities that we have in front of us. There are many practical cross-sector solutions that I'm showing only a subset of them that addresses the needs that people claim for at the local level, where we can find ways of planning food production and conservation together, complementary and interdependently. We need to move away from, as I just said, from the narratives that put them in contrast to each other. There are many ways that we can move towards sustainable fisheries, and we have done a lot already in implementing certification and more responsibility around the fishing sector as in other sectors. But we can implement in more bold ways integrated management on land, freshwater, and oceans. They are interdependent. we have heard many times during the past year the scale of plastic pollution, the scale of other sorts of pollution coming from lands far away to the oceans and our coastal zones. We need to implement climate change mitigation, but carefully. There are trade-offs if we implement climate change mitigation at a large scale, just focusing on carbon. We need to think in context-specific ways, and we need to implement those at a scale that are compatible with the social and environmental context of different places. There are multiple solutions that are nature-based solutions for cities. We need to remember that during the past decades, the largest rate of urban growth has been in the urban south. The largest portion of that growth has been among the poor that are living in cities without infrastructure, without sanitation, in a stressed environment where climate change issues become compounded and affecting increasingly a large sector of the urban population. The next 10 years, the largest share of urban growth will take place in parts of Latin America, particularly in Africa and parts of Asia. If the way we have done now will be with the same pattern that has taken place during the past 20 years, where a significant sector of society is in conditions as I described, without access to public service, in a stressed environment, exposure to pollution, and ever more vulnerable to climate change. As I said, and showed the importance of indigenous and local populations globally, we need to recognize the knowledge, innovations, practices, institutions, and values of indigenous people and local communities. They are equal partners in this journey. We need their inclusion and participation in environmental governance. And we have many examples where this has happened with significant positive impact, both for their quality of life and the quality of life of the society at large. A key constituent, and a hard one because of the amount of vested interest that we have, is to evolve our global financial and economic systems towards a global sustainable economy. This narrative needs to be integrated in the thinkings of our ministers, our governments, and each citizen. We need to steer away from the current limited paradigm of economic growth as the end and not a means to achieve better life for all. Perhaps the most important message of all is that there are many societal responses. We have been trying to confront these problems already for a few decades. There are many successful examples at the local level as well as national and international level. Change is already happening. Transformative change is already happening in many sectors. We see fast evolution from industries to local communities to whole countries who are adopting different measures to accomplish these goals. But those are not enough without bolder action and a commitment from global to local level to align our efforts and address those problems together. This alignment is urgently needed if we want to avoid a future that is even more unequal and where nature will not serve us as it has served it so far. Thank you.
Thank you to our three incredible co-chairs of the Global Assessment, and I know that that applause also went to every one of the experts, not only those who are here in the room, but to those who unfortunately have already had to leave Paris, and to everybody who's been involved in the Global Assessment. That round of applause was for all of you, and I'd like to ask for one more round of applause for everybody. I would now, before we open the floor to questions, like to invite the immediate past chair of IPBES, Sir Robert Watson, Bob Watson, to take the floor. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you. That was a truly excellent set of presentations by all three of you. So what does this report mean? And I will be repeating some of the conclusions. You've just heard from the three co-chairs who, in combination with the CLAs, many of them who are here today, the LAs and the review editors, have produced a superb report. They've committed their time and energy to alert the world of a massive problem, but have also identified many solutions. There is no doubt that this is certainly the most comprehensive report ever written, with an incredible amount of detail. But at the same time, we should recognise that the basic message is the same as what the scientific community has been saying for more than 30 years. Biodiversity is important in its own right. Biodiversity is important for human well-being, and we humans are destroying it. In 1992, at the Earth Summit in Brazil, the Convention on Biodiversity was signed, recognising that biodiversity loss needed to be halted. Well, since 1992, the loss of biodiversity has accelerated. We ignored the warnings of 30 years ago. The evidence in this report shows that biodiversity is not only an environmental issue, but it's an economic issue, a development, security, social, ethical and moral issue. Biodiversity has incredible economic value. It's central to development through food, water and energy security. It's a security issue insofar as the loss of natural resources, especially in poor developing countries, can lead to conflict. It's a moral issue. We should not destroy nature. And it's an ethical issue because the loss of biodiversity hurts the poorest of people, further exacerbating an already inequitable world. Unless we act now to reduce the loss of biodiversity, we will undermine human well-being for current and future generations. We need to slow down the loss and degradation of our natural habitats, our forests, our wetlands, our grasslands, our coral reefs. And along with this, we need to slow down the extinction of species, from insects to large charismatic species, as well, of course, plants. The failure to meet many of the Aichi targets, as you just heard, in most countries means we need actions. We don't need targets without actions. A target without a set of specified actions is meaningless. The meeting in China next year will be a critical milestone to see if there is the political will to take the evidence gathered in this report to start to implement the transformative changes we need to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity. Protected areas play a very key role in preserving and conserving biodiversity. The highest priority is to first improve the management of the current protected area system and then expand the network to encompass important biodiversity in a more holistic, connected system that takes the needs of local people, especially indigenous peoples and local communities who occupy many of the critical areas of biodiversity, as you heard in the last few speeches. Although protected areas are important, the key challenge, as you've already heard, is to integrate biodiversity concerns into all relevant economic sectors: agriculture, water, energy, forestry, mining, transportation, and most important of all, finance. As the report shows, the largest driver of biodiversity loss in terrestrial systems to date has been land use change. The conversion of native habitats, especially forests and grasslands, into the agricultural systems have been needed to feed the world. The challenge now is how do we transform our agricultural practices, which are mainly unsustainable today, to ones that produce the food we need while protecting and conserving biodiversity. This means not expanding into pristine natural habitats, but we need to use agroecological practices and use less chemicals. While climate change has not been the dominant driver of biodiversity loss to date in most parts of the world, it is projected to become as or more important than the other drivers of change. Therefore, it is essential that we address the issues of biodiversity loss and climate change together. This means we must transform the way we produce and use energy. The economic system, as you heard from the last speaker, also needs to evolve from one focus on gross domestic product. There is a need to eliminate agriculture, energy and transportation subsidies that are harmful to the environment. Introduce short-term incentives to stimulate sustainable production and consumption. There is a need to recognise and incorporate the value of natural capital into our economic accounting and to incorporate the values, monetary and non-monetary values of biodiversity into decision-making. Rarely do decision-makers recognise the importance of regulating services, the regulation of climate, pollution, pollination, flood control. These all have significant economic value. And of course, there is social value, which can't be put in economic terms. The experiences we all enjoy as we walk in a forest or walk by a stream, all of these need to be considered in decision-making. There is also a need to fully engage all stakeholders in decision-making, including the private sector, including indigenous peoples and local communities, and of course the public at large. As individuals, we need to reduce food waste, excessive use of energy and water, especially in high-income countries. But also we need to consider our choice of diet, which has a profound implication both on our health and the environment. Obviously, in addition to individual countries, we need international organisations such as UNESCO to play an important role as we move forward. Because biodiversity loss and climate change are environment, development, economic security issues, and must be addressed simultaneously, this means these issues are not just the domain of environment ministers, but equally important, it's ministers in agriculture, energy, finance, transportation. Therefore, governments need to be much more joined up, and also government departments around the world need to work together. In closing, if we want to leave a world for our children and grandchildren that has not been destroyed by human activities, we need to act now. It is crucial that governments and the private sector around the world listen to the voices of the poor. The youth-led initiative, Voices for the Planet, calls for a halt and a reversal of humanity's impact on nature and a call to protect our planet by 2020. I implore everybody to sign up to this initiative. I'm often asked, what is the scale of the problem and what is the urgency? The scale is immense. If we do not act now, many of the million threatened species will become as extinct as the dodo on this tie. I also ask, what is the urgency? The urgency, I wear cufflinks. These cufflinks of watches show me and remind me we have no time to waste. The time for action is now. This report hopefully will stimulate the world to report. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Bob Watson. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the point in this launch where we will open the floor to questions. Given that this is a media launch, I will open the questions firstly to questions from the media at this stage, and if there is time, I may open the floor to questions from other participants later. We'll start by taking questions from here in the room, and we will then go to the webcast. If I could ask you please to raise your hand and I'll call on you, and if you could then please stand and activate the microphone closest to you and speak in either English or French, and identify firstly yourself and your media organization, and then please say to whom you would like to direct your question, and I may take more than one question at a time to help speed up the process. With that in mind, I would now like to open the floor to questions from any members of the media present in the room. Do I see any questions, please? I see a question here from the lady on the side. Could we get a microphone here, please? Or if we could use the closest microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Paola Antolini. I am a scientific journalist and I am as well an anthropologist. formed by UNESCO as a junior professional officer, and also work at UNESCO for several years. So this question will be for the Director General. How many programs are now active on education for the water protection and for all the subjects that we raise? Because as the photographer Jana Truss-Bertrand said, if we are going on like this, we need the 2 Earth planet at least. But we only have one, and every year we use earlier all the natural resources. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Paula, with your permission, Madam Director General, I'm going to take a couple of questions together, and we'll then turn the questions over to each of the people directed to. Do I see any other questions from here in the room? If so, please raise your hand if you're a journalist in the room who would like to pose a question. I see a question from the gentleman over there. I'm sorry, we don't have your microphone.
Okay. Romain Loury, Journal de identify any gaps in research. I was thinking about insect populations, which according certain studies show that they've declined in Germany, Puerto Rico. Do you have any evidence about the world tendencies? And if you don't, is that a major gap for your report?
Thank you very much for the question. I'm going to ask Professor Zettler to take that question and respond to that question when we come to the answers. We'll take one more question before asking our panelists to respond. Madam, you have the floor.
My name is Sandy Dauphin. I work for Radio France, France Inter. You mentioned demography, Mrs. Diaz, and you said, I believe, that laws to moderate demographic growth. Could you expand on that? What does the report say exactly?
Thank you very much for those 3 questions. Let's take them in the order they were presented. Madam Director General, would you care to take the floor?
Thank you very much, and thank you for your question, because we believe that education to sustainable development is a very important tool in order to preserve biodiversity. It is true also for climate change. And our former chair of IPBES has mentioned the importance also of youth mobilization. I think we can all see it with the march, with the very positive and very active role that the young people play. And we are talking about their heritage. So it is very important for us to integrate education for sustainable development in our education programs. As you know, there is a specific objectives in the Agenda 2030 dedicated to education, in which there is one for education for sustainable development. So we are leading the way in order to support the member states in developing this particular aspect in both curricula, the programs, and also teachers training. We have a few examples, for instance, of the things that we do also linked to the World Heritage Sites, education, and working with local communities, for instance, in Chile. But we can do much more, I think. It's one of the existing tools that has been mentioned that can be much more developed. Hopefully we have some champions for education for sustainable development that support us in financing those programs as Japan, but I think we could have much more.
Thank you, Madam Director General. The next question was going to be answered by Professor Zettler.
Yeah, I think there was a question about the insects. We have the study, the German study in the assessment, the Hallmann et al. Study from 2017. But we had some kind of, not the newest ones are not in there because there's some kind of time limit where we could include. So we emphasized that we have a problem with insects. And in our estimate on the global decline, we assume something like 10% of them being endangered. It's a very conservative estimate. And we point out that they are understudied, so we need more studies on this. So we go in direction, we're improving the situation. It's an important aspect, but it's maybe not as highlighted as you might expect from the European setting, which is a big discussion in the last months, or last 2 years actually. But the state of knowledge was not that far that we could include all of it.
Now, I'll complement the question. We identify a number of areas that deserve more research. I mean, the list is long. I'll mention just a few. For instance, we still don't know quite a lot about, how to understand the non-material contributions of, nature and ecosystems to people's quality of life. We could advance quite a bit to value those non-material contributions and make them more visible. The relationship between different kinds of changes, how climate changes interact with species distribution, change in water systems, change in fresh water, we're starting to understand and to look across those sectors to really understand the implications. And there are also significant gaps in scenarios analysis that would be more inclusive of more complex relationships that underlie possible pathways forward.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Professor Diaz, would you like to take the question on demographics, please?
Yes. The demographic trends in the scenarios we analyzed are driven by a combination of demographic rates, so population growth, and per capita consumption. Together, they drive general consumption, total consumption, which is a critically important driver of what's going to happen with nature and its contributions to people. I would like to invite Almut Arneth, who is a specialist in these scenarios, to complement my answer.
Thanks, Sandra, and thanks for this very important question. Just very briefly from top of my head, so currently we are around about 6.7 billion people, I believe. If we're thinking about 2050, we don't know how many we will be. But the UN basically provides sort of low, medium, and high population growth estimates. The sort of, medium level by 2050 is around about 9 point something. The low population growth scenarios would actually indicate that by 2050 we have less than 9 billion people, and population growth would actually decline afterwards.
Thank you very much. Those three questions came from the floor. I'm now going to turn to my colleagues who have been taking questions from the now more than 750 participants online who are following us on the webcast, and I'd like to invite my two colleagues to share with us any questions from the webcast. Terry, I believe you have.
I have two. I have one from Seth Borenstein from the Associated Press in Washington. In more plain language, can Dr. Diaz or someone paint a picture of what 2050 will look like for humans, i.e. food, water, energy, and in general, if little is done?
Thank you very much. Will Dr. Diaz take that question? In a moment. We'll come back in a moment. And we'll have the second question, please.
The question is from a gentleman at the Deutsche Presseagentur. It's, what is the recommended approach to land-based climate change mitigation, given the warning in paragraph D8 of the summary, which relates to large-scale deployment of bioenergy plantations and afforestation of non-forest ecosystems?
Could I get an indication from our three co-chairs who, if anybody, will take that, or if one of our other experts will take that? We'll pass it to an expert in a moment. Great. So could I perhaps ask Sandra Diaz if you could please respond to the AP question from Seth Borenstein about plain language by 2050?
Plain language means that if we keep doing things like the way we do, in technology, population growth, per capita consumption, and trade, we are not going to be able to meet at the same time global objectives in terms of human well-being, particularly regulating benefits to people, food for all, and biodiversity. For more precise numbers, I would again invite our coordinating lead author, Almut Arneth.
Right, you challenged me quite a lot about numbers. I think I'm going to chicken out of the numbers. But I think the question is, what will the world look like in 2050? It is our choice. It is purely our choice. None of the scenarios we've been exploring would indicate that we cannot feed the world or cannot provide water, cannot provide shelter. That's for sure. But we can do it in a sustainable way, or we can do it in an unsustainable way. And that is really our choice.
Thank you very much, Almut. On the question from Deutsche Presseagentur about the land-based change relating to climate change, do we have a co-chair who would like to take that? Eduardo, would you?
Thank you for the question. It's a critical question given the importance of climate change mitigation during the next 10 years. We examined that question very carefully So there's quite a bit of detail in the scenarios, but basically we highlight the importance of integrated landscape management that takes into account social and ecological context and other forms of land use. Also, we highlight the importance of, when implementing these kinds of policy, the importance of inclusion, right, and participation and attention to issues of equity and how those policies may affect the livelihood of people that are in this landscapes that we are envisioning to solve some of our climate mitigation issues. I can pass to some of our colleagues as CLAs. Perhaps Kai or Pen could take a little further on the question of...
I want to return to Amit's question, if I may, a bit about what the world looks like in 2050. If we do choose the sustainable route, what the world will look like is one that is able to feed the entire planet, that's able to meet global goals for energy, that's able to do it while limiting dangerous climate change. And that world will look most different probably in terms of how our human institutions look. The way that we run our economies, the way that we do business, the way that we govern nature.
Thank you very much to Eduardo and Kai Chan. I believe we have one further question just from the webcast in French this time. Julie?
Yes, from Nature and Science. The question is, how can we put pressure on the economic players in order to bring about a paradigm shift? What are the most urgently threatened species? Insects and mammals.
So, as I understand it, there are two parts to that question. The first part is a question about political action and political pressure. The second question is about insect species. I'm going to ask Sir Robert Watson if he could perhaps take the first part of the question about what types of political levers could perhaps be used. And I'm going to again ask...
Sorry, it's economic part. It's not politic, it's economic.
Could you repeat that part, please? I don't think the translation...
Yes. How to deal, comment faire pression sur le...
How can we put pressure on the economic players in order to bring about a paradigm shift on the part of the economic players?
Sir Bob Watson.
Yes, I think Eduardo covered it rather nicely in his presentation. We clearly need to eliminate environmentally harmful subsidies. We clearly have to incorporate natural capital into the way we account. We clearly need to make sure we address the vested interests. In many countries of the world, there are many who actually like subsidies. They profit from subsidies. There's many that like gross domestic product as an economic measure, but this is not a measure of the wealth of the world. We need to understand natural capital, human capital, social capital. So we really need to get governments to think beyond GDP as a measure of wealth and incorporate these other forms of capital, natural, social, built, and human capital. That's a much better measure, but there will be lots of people with vested interests who will oppose it. Governments have to be convinced they need to think through a modified economic paradigm for a more sustainable future. And I think that's basically the message that I thought Eduardo was clearly presenting.
Thank you, Sir Bob Watson. And I believe Dr. Andy Purvis will answer the question for us about the insect question.
So the insects are less widely studied than vertebrate animals and than plants, and that means that we have a bit more uncertainty in quite how they're faring. So we know that across most other taxonomic groups of animals and plants that have been well studied, about a quarter of those species are threatened with extinction. We have good reasons for thinking it's rather lower in insects, but it's very unlikely to be lower than 10% of insect species threatened with extinction. And there's about 5.5 million insect species, so that's 500,000 species of insect threatened with extinction in the present day. Population trend data are too patchy to be able to estimate a global trend, but there have definitely been some really good studies showing sharp declines over just a generation, a human generation, in some particular areas, and very worryingly, we don't even know what's caused them. So we mentioned that. Make clear that in the report as well.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm going to open the questions again here in the room. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Silvia Yusa from El País newspaper. You've made a lot of effort saying that the governments need to act. That this is something. I mean, everybody locally, but also, I mean, the highest responsible. My question is, if you make an assessment, which regions or continents are more affected, and if there are differences in continents and regions, if this could have a political impact in the sense that some countries say, well, this is not my problem, and how to change this way of thinking, if that's the way of thinking.
Questions in the room that we can take before we move on? Madam, your question.
Julia Now, German news agency, DPA. You mentioned a few things in this direction, but I would a few more examples how human action influences nature and how this affects biodiversity, and then also, what kind of individual, personal approach I can have to change that, not only change that can be made by governments.
Thank you for the question from DPA. With the permission of the co-chairs, perhaps we could also ask that question to any of our experts who would like perhaps to take that one. Just to repeat it for the experts present, this was a question about, can we get some concrete examples about human action influences nature and what personal approaches could be taken? So if any of the experts would like to take or field that question, Patty Belvanera, I believe, is going to answer that question. So perhaps let's take those two questions. Professor Diaz, the question about differences between regions and between countries and government action versus other action. Your question, please.
As we said in the PowerPoint presentation, the planet is becoming increasingly unequal, but at the same time increasingly connected. So it's true that some regions are much more impacted than others, and scenarios indicate that they will be even more differentially impacted. Regions like basically the global south, many areas in Latin America, many areas in Africa, some areas in Southeastern Asia. So yes, those regions should be particularly worried, but the global, everybody in the world should be worried too, because the other part of the message we had is that we are increasingly interconnected. So what happens in one region unavoidably will have repercussions in all the others. We are a single interconnected web of life. And that is not just a metaphor. We have all the evidence and report to prove that. So that is a very clear message we have to tell all governments in the world. And if you allow me to encroach slightly in the next question, which is what kind of actions in the individual level, I will not go into the details, my colleague will go in there, but I would say that as a citizen, you have to claim your birthright to have a fulfilling life, deeply connected with the fabric of life, which is healthy and in working order. That's not a luxury, that's everyone's birthright.
Thank you very much, Professor Diaz, and I'd now like to ask Dr. Patricia Belvanera to add to that answer.
Yes, thank you very much. So the study shows that there are 5 direct impacts on nature with differential importance. The first one is changes in the way we use land and sea, and I will go to concrete examples in a second. The second one is direct exploitation of organisms. The third is climate change. The fourth is pollution. And the fifth is invasion of alien species. So if we go to changes in the way we use land and sea, we have shown that agricultural expansion is one of the major drivers of changes in land. So a third of today's land surface is being used today for cropping or animal husbandry. But in the seas, the fisheries is very important. It covers 50% of the sea. If we think about direct exploitation, what we have found is that today we extract 60 billion tons of materials a year from nature to satisfy our demands. So this means we extract crops and fish, but minerals and so on. If we think about invasive species, these are species that, because of trade and human activities, people moving from one place to the other, we take species with us. It can be a tiny microbe, it can be maybe a rat in a fish, and this has caused huge impacts because when they arrive in the different ecosystems, they change completely the nature of these places, and I was looking for the number of how this much has increased,
Professor
but I didn't
Valvanera.
find it, but that's another example. Sorry.
I wonder if we could perhaps have that as a further bilateral answer to that question, if anybody wants to take that further later. I believe there was one additional point that Professor Kai Chan would like to add to this as well. Kai.
The question of what individuals can do is a really important question, and it's one that the Summary for Policymakers doesn't directly address that effectively. At the moment, individuals are stuck in a place where what they're being asked to do is to consume differently and to consume less, and that is a very complicated thing that most people find daunting and paralyzing. So what we're suggesting in this report is the need to move towards a global sustainable economy. That's not going to happen on its own. We've talked about vested interests and the need to overcome them, and that need is going to have to come from the people putting pressure on businesses and on governments, voting and voting with their dollars and committing to that in a very public way. At the moment, what we have is effectively a tragic trade-off that nations face, where they have to choose between protecting their local environments or having jobs. And if they protect the local environments, those jobs get exported elsewhere with damaging development, often to less developed nations, right? And so this tragic trade-off is the cause of the lack of a global sustainable economy. If we had basic minimum standards across the board, then that would address that tragic trade-off and mean that we could lift humanity out of poverty in some cases without undermining the environment.
Thank you, Kai. And as I'm sure our media colleagues will probably want to speak to you afterwards, if you can make yourself available for more on that, I'm sure there'll be questions around that. I believe we have two more questions from the webcast. I'm going to hand back to Terry. Terry, if you can give us the next two questions, please.
The first is from Fritz Habekus from Die Zeit in Germany. And he asks, as the key messages are not much different from key messages in previous reports, the Millennium Assessment, the Global Environmental Outlook, what makes you optimistic that this report will ignite the radical change needed? And the other is from Marlo Hood at the Agence France Presse. Unlike the IPCC special report on 1.5 Celsius, the IPBES global assessment does not lay out scenarios with timelines and quantified projections of what it would take to achieve concrete targets. Why not?
So the question from Die Zeit about the key messages and the difference on the key messages, I'm going to ask Sepp Satele to answer. And the question from Marlo Hood from the AFP about the scenarios, I'm going to ask, sorry, you're pointing to our experts. We're going to ask the experts. Maybe Kai, you can take that question. Great. So Sepp, for the first question, please.
You're right, it's not, let's say, dramatically different from previous report, but the whole difference here is that it is a process behind which includes all the governments. So it's totally different from all the other reports before. We jointly have developed this in a co-designed process which takes everybody on board, so everybody's in the game. It's not just something done by some scientists somewhere, it's done, let's say, proposed by us, of course, then developed through an interchange with many rounds of comments and reviews, and then finally agreed down to the exact wording with all the governments present, around 100 governments, and something very different because it's a different commitment to the entire issue.
Thank you very much. Sepp, Eduardo, you wanted to add something?
Just to complement, there are important differences in this report in the way we approach those issues together. So the questions that we address are cross-cutting questions. We're not looking at justice, biodiversity, or climate, or social issues. The other significant difference is the systematic nature of the evaluation done in this report. the most comprehensive evaluation that has been systematic across the literature. And that includes a whole new generation of data that weren't available for other reports. The integration of data at a scale that we're able to do, I think, provides solid evidence, not only to confirm those warnings that were done before, but also, to raise issues more specifically, where it's affecting, which species groups, which kinds of ecosystems, how does it interact with the contributions of people. So I think there are very important differences that this report provides compared to others. But the message is the same. That's the message that we're coming from individuals to large organizations and international networks. We need to act together. The situation is very critical, and it's cascading at an impact that we haven't seen before.
Professor Sandra Diaz.
I just want to add that another unique component is that this is the most interdisciplinary report ever made. We have massive evidence from the natural sciences, economy, and social sciences, all put together in a consistent whole. So we can now say something that we believe wasn't said so strongly or so clearly in any previous report, is that we cannot have separate targets for biodiversity conservation, for well-being for all, and for water and food, and climate separately. We need to integrate them because they are all integrated themselves, underpinned by the fabric of life. So focusing on how we keep the fabric of life whole will allow us to bring a future with all the objectives together. That, I believe, has not been said in the other previous reports.
Thank you, Sandra. Kai, if you could please take Marlo Hood's question from the AFP about the scenarios.
Yeah, first, can I answer the two together, because they really do go together. Sandra's point is a good one. No previous assessment has considered at this scale the simultaneous challenge of protecting nature, maintaining water, feeding the planet, supplying energy, while mitigating climate change, etc. This is the most exhaustive report to have ever done that. Now, the answers to how to do that are absolutely innovative, and they come from this report. When have you ever seen an intergovernmental document that proposed or called for a global sustainable economy, that argued for the elimination of harmful environmental subsidies, and that noted that vested interests would need to be overcome to do that? I mean, these are quite outstanding things for an intergovernmental process to agree to. Nations do not have to accept our findings, and they did accept these. So that's quite startling, actually. But the point is, those answers came out of a process that was not a quantitative modeling process. I mean, partly, there were many quantitative models that supported it, but in order to answer that question about how to achieve those simultaneous goals, you have to go beyond the quantitative models, because we don't have specific quantitative models that allow us to answer the question of how all of those different goals interact together in a complex world where ecosystems underpin everything. So we don't have quantitative targets and quantitative timelines, etc., of that nature. If we did, it would be false precision. We're telling you, as has already been said by Bob and Anne, it is up to us.
Thank you very much, Kai. I'm going to open again for further questions. We have about another 10 minutes of question time available, so there is still time if you'd like to get questions in. Do I see any other questions from here in the room, from any of the journalists present? I don't see questions from journalists. I do, please.
Hi, Umi Goswami from the Economic Times. I know the report talks about a holistic approach, but often when in the conversation on climate change, there are solutions and options that are suggested, and governments take those, and those have impact on the sort of a negative impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. And I'm wondering what kind of sort of pathways or solutions have been suggested that actually approach the issue of dealing with climate change in a manner that doesn't create more harm, because often that ends up being the case. I mean, not intended, but that's the unintended consequence. Thank you.
To Almut and potentially to Professor Paul Ledley on this one as well. So we'll come back to Almut and Paul Ledley in a moment. I believe there's another question at the back.
So Jeevan Ravindran, Reuters TV. I have two questions. One is, if we continue at the same rate we're going now, at what point will we start to see irreversible consequences, and what will the first ones likely to be? And the second is, there might be different viewpoints on this, I don't know, but what was the most alarming case or finding that you came up with?
So the question about at what point do things become irreversible, and when and what? Would any of the co-chairs like to take that? Any of our experts like to take that specifically? Okay, so Professor Paul Ledley, it seems like he's going to take that part of the first question and then come on to the next question.
So when do things become inevitable? When do we pass points? That's a really important question. We discuss this in a little bit of detail in the background report, not so much in the summary for policymakers. But what we know is that some systems can tip relatively soon, and I'll just give a couple of examples. There can be major regime shifts in coral reefs over the next decade, driven by combinations of climate change, pollution, and other factors. That degradation is going on now, and it is projected to be extremely rapid unless we do something very concrete about the factors that are driving it. Another example are large changes in Arctic tundra ecosystems or Arctic and polar systems more generally. The climate change is increasing there more than any other place in the world, and that makes them highly impacted by climate change. And that could have major consequences. They're covered by ice or have ice underneath them in the soils, and those can melt, and that has tremendous consequences for both the ecosystem but also for our climate, because as that ice melts, there will be more radiation absorbed by the Earth, and there will be more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that could create feedbacks at the global scale that are extremely important and could happen over the next couple of decades.
Thank you, Professor Ledley. Kai, you wanted to add something? Or no, you were just taking the microphone back. And then I believe there was also a second part to that question, but before we get to that, the alarming cases was the second part, which were the most alarming cases. I think Professor Paul Ledley has pointed to some of those. Would anybody amongst the experts like to point to any cases or specific examples before? Edu?
Well, on the aggregate, I think when we look at wetlands and that we have severely altered 85% of the wetlands on the planet, to me that sounds pretty alarming. You know, wetlands play an important role in regions, in many areas, and that's one case of a whole system globally that creates a problem. I want to build on Paul's questions that we're starting to understand now at a global scale the interconnection of many tipping points. We're only starting to understand tipping points in Alaska, tipping points in the Amazon, tipping points in high mountains and both in the Andes or Himalayas. So we're starting to see interconnections of those brusque changes without understanding how they're gonna be. So going to a question of a future where we continue as business as usual is a future full of uncertainty and risks, of things that we're starting only to learn now.
Professor Diaz, I believe you wanted to add something?
I wanted to add that we understand that all the examples mentioned are vivid and important as illustrations, but the most important point from the report is that all these particular examples have to be understood like symptoms of the same thing. So if you think of somebody having a really serious disease, which would be the symptoms which is most critical? Which of the analyses from the lab will be the most boring? Actually, none on its own. All the analyses together compose a picture, and the whole picture, the whole consistent picture, the way they interact with others is the bad news or the good news. So in our case, the most important message is not different particular cases, but rather that everywhere in the world, the evidence points to the same trends.
Thank you. Dr. Andy Purvis, did you want to add something to that?
Just briefly to pick up on the point that Professor Diaz made there, that basically the patient here has very, very, very many symptoms. We could call it almost the death of 1,000 cuts. But it is key to remember it's not a terminal diagnosis, but the medicine has to start right away. So there are symptoms everywhere, but there are cures, and we have the choice of whether or not we take them.
Thank you, Dr. Kate Brahman.
And to bring this back around to the question about climate change interventions, one of the things that we see consistently in this report is that people are really good at working with nature to do the specific thing they want, to grow crops or harvest timber. And we are absolutely capable of working with nature to sequester carbon, to mitigate climate change. But another incredibly important message we see here is that there are trade-offs and there are possibilities for synergies, so that when we don't pay attention to the wide range of benefits that nature provides, to the life support systems, the water, the air, the non-material benefits, then we get things wrong and we don't do the job we want to do to be successful, and we can do that. So there's quite a lot of hope moving forward to take into account all of these different benefits and get that climate change mitigation that we need, as well as other benefits with it.
Thank you. Okay, I see a lot more answers from our experts, and I will allow those. Could I just get an indication before I go for those, how many more questions we have from media? So I see at least one more question here, another one not from media because this is a key partner, so that's 2 media questions. And I'm going to ask experts if you could please give those answers in your interviews afterwards. Let's get the questions asked first. First question was over here. Ma'am, you have the floor. Could you use the microphone, please? We can't hear you.
Hello everyone, affariitaliani.it is the first Italian newspaper online. I'm Paola Fedestori. My question is if in your opinion, antibiotic resistance is affected by the disruption of ecosystems, please.
It's a very specific question, and we're going to ask Professor Diaz to take that question. And then there was another question here from the lady at the back, please.
Véronique Robert de France Culture.
Véronique Robert from France Culture radio station. You spoke about the need to choose a diet. What would that international diet be? Less meat, which we're discussing a lot in the world, and particularly in France. Another question that concerns France mainly. You said that the real challenge for the future is to integrate biodiversity in the whole economic approach, and particularly in mining. What sort of mining are you referring to? Gold, for example, gold mining. Is that one of the ores that we shouldn't go mining? What would the negative impact on indigenous peoples and local communities, which would be the case for France in its overseas territory, Guyane?
Two-part question. Firstly, the part about diets. Would any of our... so Dr. Yun Shin can take the diet question. And around the mining, particularly the impact around economic mining, we're going to also throw that question to Professor Sandra Diaz. So, Professor Diaz, the first question was the antibiotic resistance. Would you like to take that question?
Yes. Thank you for that question. Actually, the antibiotic resistance that is increasingly affecting the human microbiome, which is in dynamic contact with the external microbiome, is a very good case, a very vivid case of a much more widespread phenomenon, which is fast contemporary evolution in the face of anthropogenic pressures. We are all used to think that evolution is something that happens over thousands or millions of years. But we have overwhelming evidence that evolution can go really fast under human pressures. Organisms evolve as a result of what we are doing to them. We have cases with antibiotic resistance. We have cases of increased resistance of weeds to massively applied pesticides. We have cases of fungi. We have cases of mammals. We have cases of birds. and insects adapting to the new conditions posed by big cities, etc. So, the extent of our that we are directly reconfiguring the evolutionary process itself, including antibiotic resistance, of course.
Thank you very much, Professor Diaz. Dr. Yun Shin, you wanted to make a comment?
Yes, about the question of, I can't remember which media, but about a sober consumption, which is one of the main levers of a transformative change, and talking about sober consumption in developed countries. So there are material benefits provided by nature, fiber, water, but also food. And I'll take an example for food. There are studies which showed quite recently that if you reduce the level of animal protein in the diets of people in developed countries, you can substantially reduce the area dedicated to pasture and to agriculture. That has a huge effect. Likewise, the food wastage is an enormous amount of the food production in the world. There are between 40 and 50% of the fruit and veggies which are wasted, about 30% of cereals. So just to say that in developed countries, those wastes happen at the very end of the food chain production. It happens at the very end of the food distribution and on the consumer's plate. Whereas in developed countries, it happens more upstream, that is in terms of the production capacity and in terms of the storage capacity. So there are things here to be done, and in terms of food waste, food consumption, change in food consumption patterns, but also equity in access to the resources. If you allow me, I'll give you an example for equity, but otherwise,
I'll finish. To stop it there because there are a number of questions still pending which we do need to get to. We're running very short on time. There was still the outstanding question about what to do with economic issues and particularly mining, which I believe was outstanding. Would any of the co-chairs like to take that? Eduardo Brandizio?
Yeah, in a brief way, mining is a particular case because the spatial footprint of mining is very small, but the environmental impact is very significant, and the social impact can be significant. You have, in many areas, a number of pollution of heavy metal and other issues that are associated with mining that enter into food chains, enter into fresh water and land food chains that then end up being distributed with a high impact. You have direct impact of pollution and extraction on local populations in particular. Many of the areas where you have indigenous areas are the frontiers of mining in the planet, and that is expanding, continue to expand both in the Arctic or in regions like the Amazon and in regions like Africa. And mining is far beyond environmental problems. Mining, when of course done without the responsibility that it requires, it has huge implications for social impact and conflicts. I think one of the biggest challenges, not only to say about the negative impacts of mining, is that mining is one of the sectors where we need to implement a circular economy. And there are sectors in mining, there are countries that are starting to confront that. So it's an example where an industry that we also depend on, can take a different path by reconsidering its impacts from beginning to end along the full chain of production, processing, distribution, and consumption.
Thank you, Professor Eduardo Brandizio. I'm going to take the last two questions from our webcast that have come in. Terry Collins, if you can give us those two questions, please.
Yes, it's again from Seth Borenstein at the AP. Just if the answer could be provided in simple and very simple language, can you tell the average person who lives in a city why this matters to them, why it's more than just species?
I see Professor Kate Brahman Dr. Kate Brahman would like to take that question. I'm going to ask the other question as well to come through.
Again, and this is again Marlo Hood from AFP. Can Bob Watson elaborate on vested interests? Concretely, what industries and sectors are we talking about?
So in order to give Dr. Bob Watson an opportunity to think quickly about that, Kate Brahman, if you could please take the question about people living in urban areas, why this is important in simple language, please.
we see tremendous opportunities for people in urban areas to take advantage of the benefits that nature provides. So this includes everything from urban green spaces, parks, which have been shown to have an effect on mental health and childhood learning, to really actually managing some of the problems in cities like stormwater or potentially air pollution. There are lots of opportunities to take advantage of the benefits of nature at home. And also as people in cities travel, what happens around the world comes back and affects them through trade, through learning, through inspiration. And we've seen many connections at home.
Thank you very much.
Rob,
yes,
yeah,
you'd
I
like
want
to
to
add?
complement that question. You know, we're here in Paris. Can you experience Paris without nature? Every place we turn, corner here, we see biodiversity exposed to us on the streets. When we open the tap here, we drink excellent water, right? When we look at the parks and when we look at the atmosphere in the city, it's all about nature.
Thank you very much. Sir Bob Watson for the question about vested interests.
Yeah, totally simple question. There's many in the fossil fuel industry that have energy subsidies. Much better to use that money as an economic incentive to stimulate renewable energy, wind and solar, or to stimulate the generation of new electric cars. There's many agricultural subsidies that farmers received, rather than subsidising production, subsidising agroecological processes with incentives. So there's a lot in the fossil fuel industry, the agricultural sector, who would not want to see energy subsidies reduced, transportation subsidy or agricultural subsidy. But it's these sort of hard decisions that governments need to take.
Thank you very much. We have reached the end of the time available for the questions. As was my choice last year, I'm going to do the same this year. I'm going to let one question be from a non-media participant, and I recognize Gunther Mittlacher from WWF Germany.
Yes, thank you very much. There was a lot of discussion on what the role of decision makers are, and that's very clear in my view. But what's the role of business, private sector? There was not this debated here. I think there was a lot in the report that is relevant for business as well. Can you reflect on that a little bit more? Thank you.
And since this is the last question, I'm going to first ask one of our experts here to answer it.
Yeah, Jack Liu from Michigan State. I think business community has a lot to offer and also has a lot to lose if we don't protect biodiversity. Because talk about the Coca-Cola, for example, the company which make soft drinks. They need really good water to make drinks. If without drinks, they cannot do anything, right? They will run out of business. Talk about the ski industry. Without snow, they cannot do anything. But a lot of times they also need the clean snow. If they have polluted snow, then people will be affected and the host problem will be. And talk about the food industry. Without biodiversity, we don't have food to eat. Like rice is a major food for Asian countries and around the world, even in France. And the hybrid rice is made of the wild rice. I think that's very important. Everything like we need to take care of is from the business, but business rely on wildlife, wild plants and biodiversity and in general. So I think biodiversity actually is probably more important than to business community than many other people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jack Liu. Eduardo Brondizio.
I want to complement this question and this answer by highlighting that it's the alignment of individual actions, of business, of governments that will make a difference. And we have experience where this has happened. You know, if we think about the Montreal Protocol, when we start to realize the thinning of the ozone layer, when you start to see the potential health implications of the ozone layer, that message came across very quickly. People start to use sprays in their house. Businesses start to look for new technologies. Industries, whole industries transformed to include new technologies. And international cooperation legislations make that happen, so we saw the impact of that true transformative change that happened many years ago, and that we shouldn't forget that's possible. And that's possible because individuals did that, business did that, technology responded to that, and international cooperation act together.
Thank you very much. We literally are very short on time. Kai, you wanted to make one final comment on this, but quite short, please.
A crucial role for business is also to transform supply chains. So that means working within their sector to raise the standards for all. In many cases, businesses have frankly been in opposition to regulations, but when they work outside of government regulations, as has been done for a number of commodities, such as through the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, then they can work together to raise standards such that the bad actors within an industry are not pulling down the rest. Palm oil has a really bad name, and it's because there are some really bad actors, but there are also some good actors there.
Thank you very much, and thank you to WWF Germany for that question. I'd also like to just recognize the fact that under the hashtag Call for Nature today, there was a call put out by the WWF network based on a lot of the work that is coming out of the IPBES report. So if anybody would like to talk to WWF afterwards also, that's, I'm sure, available. This brings us to the end of the question and answer session today, and also to the end of the media launch event. Before we close, I would like to remind everybody this is not the end of the IPBES Global Assessment Report. In fact, it is just the beginning. We move now to the phase of uptake and impact. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, especially the Director General of UNESCO, for all of their participation. I'd like to again thank all of our experts for their work over the last 3 years. And finally, thank you to all of you who joined us here today in person and via the webcast. Your interest in this report and your willingness to report on it to the world makes these efforts worthwhile and will be the foundation of their impact. Thank you all very much, and a very good day to you all. Thank you. Yes, one group photo. Colleagues at the top table, could we get one group photograph of everybody together?